the multidisciplinary spectrum as of 2025. This is a video where I just wanted to quickly go over what the spectrum is, why I made it, and how does it work, and how am I going to change it in the near future. So I am working on revamping it once again. In the past, I had it kind of as a chart, linear chart, where you had a point A, point B, and it's kind of how it is now, but I wanted to make it a little bit more multifaceted and have different pathways and approaches to it. I'll link down in the description my post about using the multidisciplinary spectrum and how it's actually effectively going to help you. And that kind of goes into why I made it in the first place too. So what is it? And let me just show you screen share here for you. Essentially speaking, it's point A to point B, kind of that linear function before, and that's what this main pathway is. If you are a polymathic person from the get-go, you know that for a fact, then this is probably the pathway for you. You start off as a multipotentialite, you're pluripotent, you are able to do many different things, and you have that curiosity that's about many different things. But you haven't lived long enough, or you haven't delved deep enough and enough areas to really kind of level up. But you have that potentiality. Next is the jack of all trades. Now I know that some people would consider this to be an equivalent to polymath. There's probably plenty of people who anchor to jack of all trades, Jill of all trades term that are polymaths, but they just don't necessarily choose that word. That's fine. That's not really the point though of this conversation. The conversation is that you are multi-passionate. You have spent a decent amount of time exploring that pluripotency and the multipotentiality and actually spent some time working on those skills. More than likely, you're going to be at a novice or adept level, which means you haven't spent that much time in that field, but you can get pretty good at a skill within 20 hours. And I think that jack of all trades kind of people, the jotes, those are the type of people who tend to spend a decent amount of time in, let's say, 12 to 15 different areas. And that's where I'll get into this later. I'm intending to improve this spectrum where essentially I give numbers to each one, and these are numbers that I envision that make sense for that particular term. And as you can see, there's quotations and parentheses between each one, and those are alternative names for that same level. And I kind of wanted to include as many terms as possible to allow you to understand, like, hey, I like the term scanner. Where does that fit? Okay, that's generalist level. Now, before we move on to generalist, though, I want to take a little detour here to T-shaped. Now, the reason why I have this off at different tangents is that it starts to become a little bit more closer to a specialist. T-shaped is that person who has one deep area. Again, you haven't spent enough time to really become like a masterful expert in that field, but theoretically, you could technically be a T-shaped person that is an expert, but more than likely it is someone who is a journeyman level, if you will, kind of going off of that RPG scale, role-playing game scale of like, okay, you have novice, adept, and journeyman, expert, and master, and it's a very basic scaling factor. And I think that's one reason why I haven't actually changed the spectrum very much, is that there isn't very many scales out there. There is that RPG scale, there is like some scientific scales, but when it comes to quantifying a mastery over a subject, that is very subject dependent, really, for the most part. But we just need generic terms for the level up of a skill. So I think once I can figure out which ones to really use, that's when I'll go in and add a legend on here to give you keys of like, okay, here's what this means and what that means. But the T-shaped person is someone who has, let's say, a journeyman level of expertise, maybe expert, but generally kind of the middle ground with a wide range underneath. And that's generally like a T-shaped marketer or something like that, but it doesn't have to be just in marketing. That's where it originated though. Next is the generalist, and you also have the specialist as well, but let's just focus on the main pathway here. This proto-polymath, if you will, is where I consider myself at this point. Some people would consider me as a polymath. They've called me that, and that's okay, but I consider myself more of a generalist just due to my age. And I also do it also to kind of take back the ego of it too. I'm not trying to be egotistical by calling myself a polymath. So I think that proto-polymath, someone who's on the journey of it, that's more fitting. And I keep doing these hand gestures, but you can't actually see me. So why don't I turn this back on? Hold on. And yeah, there we go. I'm on that journey. And so the generalist is that factor of, hey, here I am, I'm doing, let's say, 3 to 5, maybe 7 different areas instead of the 15 or 12 of the jack of all trades. But now I'm a journeyman, or at least adept, in those many different areas. And I think that that is where you split your attention between half a dozen different things. However, you have spent a decent amount of time at each one. I'm 30 now. I feel like I've definitely spent a decent amount of time, if not a level of expertise in these areas. But I just think the journeyman is a little bit more fitting in some cases, like Content creation, I would consider myself an expert in. Gaming, I would consider myself an expert in. But building computers, probably more of a journeyman, because I just haven't built that many computers over the course of my life. I built more than the average person. I know the internal parts of computers very well because I'm a nerd about computer parts, but I'm not necessarily a masterful expert on it or anything like that. Not Linus Tech Tips, if you will. And then you have the Polymath. And the Polymath is someone that is a multi-expert, 3 or more areas of deep level of knowledge. It's a multi-specialist, if you will. And polyhistor is just an alternative word for polymath. But it is the multi-expert plus width. You have that same curiosity that the multi-potentialite and jack of all trades has, but you have that multiple expertise of a deep level. More than likely, you're not going to be a master in that field, because to get mastery, you have to be in the top 20th percentile, and generally expertise kind of ends between the 80 and 85 percentile range. Now, being an expert could go up to 90, and you could necessarily be a 90 percentile person of expertise, but I don't think that many polymaths will generally get to that masterful level. This is something that I'm just talking to you about right now. It doesn't have to actually be put in stone. This is just kind of me thinking out loud. This is what I was thinking when I made this particular system. But this is something I wanted to mention, in the fact that, like, hey, there's a difference between being an expert, and that means that means specialist in the field, an expert, and a master. And a master is someone who's at the top of the field, PhD, kind of deep, ultra deep, hyper specialist, if you will. And in order to get to that level, you either have to spend a ton of time in that field, or really just kind of negate other fields altogether just to focus on that one. Now, I think that if you live long enough, there is a point, and I'm going to turn off my camera so you can see the rest of the scale here. There is a point of getting to the universalist polymath. That is someone who I would consider to be close to Da Vinci level. Someone who has that deep, masterful level, or at the very least, it's kind of like twofold. You either have 1 to 3 master level expertise, right? You are an ultra specialist in 3 different areas, or I can't say or more confidently, but you can say theoretically or more. Because at this point, Da Vinci was like one of the prime examples of someone who was a multi-expert in 15 different fields. He took that same jack of all trades approach, but basically took all 15 of those areas and made them expert level stuff. That's why there is a separate level here. You don't need to attain this level in order to be a polymath, and you don't have to get that level. You don't have to be an ultra specialist if you don't want to. In fact, it might even be healthier for you to stay at the normal polymath level so you can indulge your curiosity even more. The universalist polymath is someone who basically chose to be at that level. I think this is a good time to switch back to Basecamp, because essentially the universalist polymath is what a lot of these polymath researchers are actually kind of talking about, in the sense of like, hey, if you're on that extreme, what does it look like? What is it called? And that's why I called it that, because the universalist is a term that I used to have on the spectrum on its own. But I think that it fits more into this extreme polymathy example. If you want to be polymathic in your life, that's great. If you want to be a specialist who tends to have polymathic tendencies, you're probably a T-shaped person. Or maybe an expert generalist, which essentially is someone who has that one area of expertise and has many different areas of medium level expertise. That's why the expert generalist is a thing, because it's kind of like taking the T-shaped or generalist and upgrading all of them while having one major expertise. But let's say you take that medium level and you make multiple expertise levels. That means you're a polymath, right? But if you have 3 to 5, then you can probably sit around that normal polymathy range. If you have more than 5, you're definitely a universalist polymath. And that is something that I think is exciting to me. I want to reach that level. I want to reach that Da Vincian level. And that's what my goal is to be. But for you, you might not care, and that's okay. This whole scale is meant to be a way for you to understand, where do you fall along this scale? Where do you want to be? And have you spent a lot of time learning but not actually doing anything with it? You might be more of a dilettante. You need to get out of that hole. Are you someone who's a specialist but wants to become someone who is more multifaceted? Well, here's the pathways to do it. And I think that I think I need to move this down. This needs to be down here so the specialist can then lean into this level. But essentially speaking, each one of these has different numbers associated with it and different ranges of how many areas and those numbers too. And so I wanted to basically give you a scale to understand, where are you at? Where can you anchor yourself down? What terms do you anchor yourself with already? Do you identify with? And then where can you go from there? Because it really is about leveling up to polymathy. Thank you.